Good morning, everybody. I am so pleased to have this opportunity to welcome you to a joint webinar hosted by the University of Waterloo Water Institute and the forWater and CERC Network for Forested Drinking Water Source Protection Technologies. My name is Monica Amelko. I'm a professor and Canada Research Chair in Water Science, Technology and Policy in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Waterloo. I'm also the scientific director of the forWater Network and a very happy member of the Water Institute at the University of Waterloo. I am extremely pleased to be able to introduce not one, but two fantastic speakers today who will be discussing the very important relationship between landscape management, and our water resources with respect to especially water quality and implications to both ecosystem services and drinking water. So before we get started, the two speakers today are Professor Adrian Collins, who is a hydrologist and head of sustainable agriculture sciences at Rothamsted Research in the UK, and Professor Christophe Darnault, who is an associate professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Clemson University. Given the importance of the relationship between the landscape and our water supplies, I'd like to first take a moment to acknowledge the land that the University of Waterloo is situated upon as the Haldeman Tract. That is land that was promised to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River and is within the territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. We acknowledge the land today to recognize that water is inextricably linked to the land and intertwined with the history of Indigenous peoples here in Waterloo and everywhere across Canada, where the forWater Network conducts research and where the Water Institute is situated. So on that note, I'd like to go ahead and get started. So our first speaker today, as I mentioned, is Dr. Adrian Collins, and he is going to be talking about the Aspire program in the UK, which is focused on improving management of sediments. And he's going to share with us those perspectives and experiences. So Adrian, please go ahead and take it away. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Monica. So it's a good afternoon from here in the UK. And as you've just heard, I'm going to talk you through a very brief narrative of some of my ongoing work designed to help management of the fine-grained sediment problem over here in the UK. So just by way of general background, only about 16% of our surface water bodies nationally in England are currently classified as being in high or good ecological status under the Water Framework Directive. And that's important because it means that we have a water pollution gap that requires closure through improved management. And in tandem with that, it means that we have a sediment pollution gap that equally requires some closure. So if we think of the fine-grained sediment problem over here in the UK, it has a number of key components, and some of those are illustrated here with some photographs, which I thought would be useful by way of background and context setting. So one of the issues is accelerated soil erosion, and that often occurs in tandem with modern intensive farming practices, including those in livestock systems. Another issue is accelerated connectivity between land and rivers. And in our case, that's quite often driven by assisted or artificial field drainage. So approximately 40% of our farmland nationally in England has some form of assisted drainage to help productivity and management of the land. And then, of course, we have the off-site issues, and those include, amongst others, the siltation of riverbeds and also the detrimental impacts of that excess fine sediment on the biological endpoints. And there we see detrimental impacts on all trophic levels, including, for example, the aquatic plants. Now, if we're talking about the sediment pollution problem in the UK, I thought it would also be very useful just to underscore the legal definition of fine sediment as a stressor here. And that's important because actually the legal definition covers both the mineralogic component of sediment as a stressor, but also, and importantly, the sediment-associated organic matter content of sediment as a stressor. And if we think about this, that dual definition of sediment as a stressor in the environment is important because logically it immediately has implications for how we might better manage the problem. So if we accept that we have a fine sediment problem, we have a sediment pollution gap, which requires closure through targeted best management. We, as a result of that, need a target or a threshold so that we can try to map compliance or non-compliance. And if we consider existing approaches or targets or thresholds adopted internationally as sediment targets for informing river catchment management, we can see those typically fall into two categories. So on the left, we have one category which concerns water column metrics. So here we might see thresholds or standards associated with light penetration, turbidity metrics, suspended sediment concentration summary statistics, or information on sediment regimes, which might include information on sediment yields. And then over on the right, we see the second category, which concerns river substrate metrics. And there we often see use of information on substrate composition or embeddedness, alternatively information on riffle or relative bed stability. So a range of approaches are used internationally as targets to help inform compliance assessment for sediment pollution. Now, by way of further background, for many years in the UK, we actually had a single global management target for all river catchments and water bodies nationally, which was embodied in the Freshwater Fish Directive. And that stipulated a guideline annual mean suspended sediment concentration of 25 milligrams per litre. And that threshold was largely based on pieces of work looking at the detrimental impacts of excess fine sediment pressure, particularly on our valuable game fish, so salmonids, so Atlantic salmon, brown trout and sea trout in particular. But in December 2013, the Freshwater Fish Directive was repealed. Now, regardless of that legal act, there had for some time been ongoing scientific debate about the robustness or logic, or indeed lack of, using a single global target for all rivers nationally, regardless of any gradient in geoclimatic setting. And so what all of these developments underscored was the need for the development of a new framework for guiding improved management of excess sediment in the UK. Now, after 3 rounds of open competition, which spanned a period of about 18 months, so a very intensive exercise, I was very fortunate to be the PI of a research consortium that won a national scale project, which was policy driven. And this project aimed to develop a new management approach for assisting in the management of the sediment problem here in the UK. Now, obviously, given time constraints, I can't step you through all elements of this project. But in this slide, I'm showing critical elements of the main output, which was the ASPIRE framework. ASPIRE standing for Agricultural Sediment Pressures and Impacts on Riverine Ecology. And ASPIRE, in essence, is a generic sediment pressure impact framework. And the schematic here summarizes its key components. So our starting point is estimation of background sediment pressures. The next step is then estimating any excess over background in conjunction with current management practices of the landscape. We then move to assessing the impacts of any excess sediment on biological endpoints. And the framework includes two trophic levels. So we have impacts on fish, which are assessed using the sediment intrusion and dissolved oxygen UK or SIDO UK model. And then we also have an attempt to assess the impacts of excess sediment on macroinvertebrates. And then the overall aim is to use all of the information captured in the framework to estimate the load reduction targets on a catchment-specific basis required to improve the scores for aquatic ecological status. So as I showed in the schematic of the Aspire framework, the starting point was our novel intention to assess intrinsic or background sediment pressures. Now, we felt that this would be very important for two reasons. Firstly, given the noise in the dose-response relationships between sediment and biological endpoints, we felt that if people were happy to take our estimates of background sediment loss as targets in their own right, then this piece of work would help us estimate the sediment pollution gap. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, we felt that if we estimated background sediment pressures, we could use that estimate or those estimates to correct the pollution gap, to represent the proportion of that gap that is driven by intrinsic factors. Because the logic here in discussions with the policy teams was that if a component of the pressure is background or intrinsic, then no management strategy should waste resources in targeting that component of the pollution gap. When we first started this work, we perhaps were a little naive, and it was an interesting journey. So at the beginning, we wanted to try to estimate truly intrinsic rates of sediment loss, and we reviewed the information from the longest term dated records available for sedimentary environments in the UK. But what that showed was that if we wanted to use truly intrinsic rates, we'd be taking values that hadn't existed in the UK since AD 1100. And the reason for that was that all of our very long-term records nationally suggested that there'd been a huge step increase in erosion and sediment impacts on our watercourses between AD 1100 and 1400, in conjunction with the first widespread uptake of the plough in our ancient farming systems. So this gave us a strong dose of reality. And of course, another dose of reality was that we need food production from our land, and we have other pressures on our land. We're a small island, including population growth. And so we turned our attention to trying to identify modern background sediment pressures on our watercourses, and we reviewed paleolimnological evidence and reconstructed sediment yields for 19 sites nationally. And that clearly identified that the most recent step change in erosion and sediment delivery in our systems had occurred from 1948 onwards, so post-World War II. And that coincided with a drive for intensification post-World War II, and that coincided with the widespread uptake of the diesel-powered tractor in our farming systems. So on the basis of these dated cores, we came up with our minimum and maximum estimates of modern background sediment pressure on our rivers, rather than an estimate of truly intrinsic sediment loss. If you recall the schematic of the Aspire framework, our next stage in the work was to come up with our best estimates of current sediment loss or current sediment pressure on our river systems nationally. And so here, our starting point was the agricultural sector, because agriculture is our dominant land use nationally. It was a specific focus of the policy team driving this work. And we devised a system for taking account of the losses associated with the key land cover types, particularly arable land and intensively managed grazing land. That accounts for about 66% of our land cover. And importantly, though, we also corrected those emissions for the impact of the current uptake of best management practices. And here in the UK, that current uptake of best management intervention is driven by three things: regulation, on-farm targeted advice, and incentivization, where the incentivization might be a paid for ecosystem services scheme being managed by a water utility, or it could be one of our national agri-environment schemes. So on this basis, we were able to map nationally the current sediment stress on our river systems, and importantly to really target those areas shown in red where agriculture was deemed to be the dominant source of any excess pollution associated with fine-grained sediment. Now, of course, we recognised that agriculture is not the only source of fine-grained sediment in our catchment systems. And so the next stage in our journey was to develop some national layers and models for estimating losses of sediment to all rivers nationally from non-agricultural sources. And as you can see from this slide, those non-agricultural sources were represented by urban areas, so diffuse losses from residential and industrial sites. We included a national layer on point source discharges from sewage treatment works. So we obtained the national database of consented effluent discharges, 20,000 sewage treatment works nationally. So these are discharges reported by water companies and the Environment Agency. And then we developed a novel national scale channel bank erosion to estimate inputs to all rivers nationally from the bank erosion source. And just by way of a little background, that new model for bank erosion is based on the duration of excess shear stress as a proportion of the year. It includes channel density, because to my mind, that's a measure of the opportunity for bank erosion. A denser network, more opportunity. And we also include sinuosity in the bank erosion model because we found a very strong relationship between the magnitude of bank sediment loss and situations where more than 10% of the main channel system had a sinuosity score of between 1.3 and 1.7. And we calibrated the bank erosion model using measured sediment yields combined with source apportionment, which was driven by sediment source fingerprinting work. So on this basis, we were also able to identify nationally those water bodies where non-agricultural sources were the dominant source of any excess sediment stress on the aquatic environment. Taking you back to the Aspire diagram, the next stage was to use our best estimates of excess sediment pressure to compute the impacts on the biological endpoints. And again, in the interests of time and being brief, I will just talk about some of the work concerning the macroinvertebrate biological endpoint. So for this work, we identified an initial data set of 12,500 potential sampling sites. And from that, we sampled 230 sites nationally, shown on the map in the middle there, using conventional 3-minute kick sampling. And then at species level, we used for sediment tolerant and intolerant taxa to identify and develop a new macroinvertebrate index for fine sediment pressure called COFSE. And importantly, this is responsive to those two components of sediment stress that are identified in the legal definition of sediment as a stressor, both the mineralogic component and also the component that's embodied by sediment-associated organic matter. So the information was then put into the statutory reporting tool that is used here in the UK, RIVPAC's RICT, the River Invertebrate Classification tool, and that enabled us to compute the expected COFSE scores, and then of course to modify those to the observed scores as computed using our best estimates of current sediment loss in excess of our best estimates of background sediment loss. So this gave us an additional means of understanding the size of the sediment pollution gap that required closure under improved best management. Now, as we know, policy teams are often very interested in spatial targeting of best management interventions rather than blanket application. Blanket application is rarely cost effective, and so it's not good expenditure from the public or private purse. And so we used the Aspire framework to develop maps for spatial priorities where sediment management needed to be increased. So here we took account of where there was an excess sediment pressure, either over and above our minimum estimate of background sediment pressure as shown on the left, or in excess of our maximum estimate of background sediment pressure, the map on the right. But in addition to that, we also took account of where agriculture was the dominant source following the correction for the impacts of current best management. And we identified these areas as spatial priorities because the policy team was particularly interested in improving management of the sediment, the excess sediment being lost from the agricultural sector because it's so spatially dominant here in the UK. Now, an important feature of the Aspire framework is that as well as enabling estimation of the size of the pollution gap, and enabling estimation of the impacts on two biological endpoints, those being fish and macroinvertebrates, it also affords the functionality to simulate the technically feasible impacts that might arise from increased uptake of best management interventions. And here we included 18 best management interventions, and these can be run within the framework either individually or as management bundles. And in many cases, the policy teams are really interested in trying to optimize management bundles for delivering quite tight messages to landowners. And I'm sure that you'll notice that these are quite well known and quite well tested on the farm management practices for managing fine sediment emissions. So things like establishing cover crops in the autumn, managing overwinter tram lines, and establishing new hedges or riparian buffer strips. But what I wanted to draw your attention to were some of the options at the bottom of the table, because if you recall, the legal definition of fine sediment pressure also concerns sediment-associated organic matter. And in the case of our intensive farming systems, that pressure is quite often driven by the loss of farmyard manures and slurries applied to our agricultural land. And so we also included some interventions that are designed to help reduce those losses from farmland to watercourses. So things like incorporate your manure into the soil rapidly, do not apply manure to high risk areas, and do not spread slurry or poultry manure to fields at high risk times. Now, just by way of example, I wanted to illustrate some of the outputs that we've generated with Aspire. So in this table, I'm showing some numbers that firstly represent the costs and the impacts of blanket application of all 18 mitigation measures, but to the relevant farm systems nationally. And Aspire computed that that would cost annually about £1.7 billion, and that the corresponding reductions in total emissions at national scale to our rivers would amount to a 23% reduction against business as usual in the case of the mineralogic sediment, and about a 49% reduction against business as usual in terms of sediment associated organic matter. We then computed similar numbers, but using the spatial priorities that were identified on one of my previous slides. And those estimates, not surprisingly, suggested a dramatic reduction in the cost to the public purse. So typically around 300 to 350 million pounds annually. Now, of course, the reductions in terms of total national scale emissions would be much reduced. So between 5 to 7% of the mineralogic sediment and about 4% of sediment associated organic matter. But of course, that's masking the quite significant impacts that would be observed within individual catchments or water bodies. And importantly, in the middle row, you see that if we enact those interventions using the spatial prioritization, then the annual cost per tonne of pollutant saved declines. However, as we've passed these numbers through to the biological endpoints, the main story that came out was that those interventions, even if they were implemented at 95 to 100% at all relevant farms, either within the spatial priorities or indeed in a blanket approach, would not deliver the reductions in fine-grained sediment pressure required to improve aquatic biological status. And so I wanted to finish by just saying that whilst we can aspire to manage the fine-grained sediment problem, what this framework really tells us is that we need some actual structural land cover change rather than more typical agri-environment measures to deliver proper closure of the sediment gap at the magnitude needed to improve our scores for aquatic ecology. And I'll just finish by acknowledging the main funder here in the UK for this work, the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. And I also wanted to acknowledge some of my academic partners, so the University of Southampton, Queen Mary University of London, the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and my former employer, ADAS. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much for your talk, Adrian. Much appreciated. And there are already questions popping in, so I will encourage folks to submit questions either to the Q&A box or to the chat box, whichever you prefer. And what we'll be doing is we'll having a question and answer session after both speakers have had the chance to speak. So I'll go ahead and invite Professor Christophe Darnault to start sharing his screen. And just mention that Christophe will be speaking about sustainable water resources management, especially in the context of karstic aquifers via recycling and reuse of wastewater, by irrigation on agricultural and forestry lands. That'll be the first part of his talk. And then he's also going to talk about prescribed burning or prescribed fire and its effects on soil properties and hydrological processes as well. And of course, prescribed fire is yet another landscape management strategy. And so it continues on with this theme focused on the interaction between landscape management and water resources. And so on that note, again, I'll encourage you to please keep adding questions to either the chat box or the Q&A, and I will pass it off to Christophe. Thanks so much.
All right, well, thank you very much, Professor Monica and Mirko, for these kind of introductions, and also for inviting me to give a lecture series seminar on my research work. I also would like to acknowledge Eleanor Waslander and Marian from the Water Institute to facilitating that seminars. So as you mentioned, my talk, oops, here we go. My talk will be of two parts. First will be related to the sustainable water resource management and enhanced management of karstic aquifer, especially looking at a case study of the living filter. That's at the University of Penn State, University of Pennsylvania. That is being used for recycling and reuse of wastewater irrigation of agriculture and forestry land for enhanced groundwater recharge of the karst aquifer in a seasonably cold climate in Pennsylvania, United States. And then the second part will be related to the effect of fire on hydrology and geochemistrial soil, especially assessing the impact of prescribed fire on infiltration phenomena of water and sorption processes of different types of compounds like polar and non-polar compounds in forest soil of the southwestern United States. So in terms of the background, looking at wastewater reuse, this is being used for irrigation and also management of aquifer recharge. So here you have illustrated different applications of the recyclings and sustainable practices for water reuse. In this case, Penn State has been recycling their wastewater since the 60s due to some issue with contaminations of nearby streams. So they have been using that recycling of wastewater to irrigate farm field and forest field. And they have some concern of how sustainable is that since they have been doing that for the 60s. So we'll be especially looking at issues related to the surface processes. You can see here some depression formations and with the presence of water, and also looking at the nitrate contamination of the groundwater. And then in terms of the fire, you can see here on the left, the fire worldwide, which are being occurring since the early 2000s. And you can see they are widespread. And with these fire, you have issues also related to the impact of wildfire on soil and water resources. In some cases, you have erosion that can take place, landslide, you have some water quality issue with some ash and sediment, and also some development of repellency of some of the soil that creates some change in hydrologic and hydric settings. So moving on to the first topic related to the sustainable water resource management and enhanced management of karstic aquifer. This is the site of the living filter, again in operation since the 1960s, where Penn State recycle all their wastewater for irrigation practices. And they have been doing it again since the 1960s to mitigate some contaminations of nearby streams. So here are the two sites that made the living filter. We have the Gameland site on the left, and we have the astronomy site on the right. And we'll be focusing on the astronomy site, which include crops field over here and also some forest land. And what has been noted at the surface is the presence of some swells that result from some presence of fractures down below. And also in terms of the subsurface of the systems, we have karst, and one of them example would be the Birmingham Thrust Fault. So this karst environment is underlaying the land. So we want to see how these underlying features impact the surface processes. So we have observed some depression formations into the crop site over here with the pictures A to D. And also into the forest site, we can see the depressions formations also located. And we want to see if these locations of depressions are in agreement with some underlying geology, which are the presence of fractures. So with some existing, with some existing tracers informations, which are delineated with a blue line, we also use LiDAR and GIS to map the depression formations on the site. And we're going to be only focusing on the green ones, since the purple ones within the boundary in red are too close to some roads. So we only kept the green depressions, and to study the locations as they relate to the fractures. And you can see that in most cases, they align well with the presence of this fracture trace down below. And then we'll be comparing the change of these depressions over the years 2000 and 2017. So here on the crop side, you can see in black, this is the fracture trace. And you can see that the depressions line up well with it, and also the change over the years. The same thing goes with the forested site, where you can see that the depression lines well with the presence of these fracture traces. And then overall, we have the adjustments of these depressions of 8,000 square feet, with the progressions of the forested site of 13,000 square feet, and only 5,000 square feet where soil has to regress over the years. And now, as we look at the profiles of these depressions, we can focus on two of them, the AA prime and the BB prime, which one belong to the crop site, the other one belong to the forested site. And then we can see the shape of these profiles of these depressions. Into the crop site, it is a V-shaped type systems compared to the forested site with a U-shaped systems. And that's also corroborated by previous work of Collins in 2005. And then moving on to the modeling to predict and also to assess the nitrate contaminations, we first developed conceptual models of the Spring Creek watershed, which is also included a karstic environment. And then using ModFlow, we were able to model the groundwater flow systems of the entire watershed. And also we compared that to some already existing models, and we had a good calibrations. So it was confident that our model was appropriate. And then as we now run the nitrate modelings using MT3DMS with ModFlow, we can see how the models predicted the nitrate transport, and they all meet the criteria of 10 milligram per liters. And now we compare the predicted values to some existing value that we observed, and they also well match the observed value and measured values. So give us some confidence into the model. And then in 2035, we're also able to predict then the estimated nitrate modelings, nitrate concentration, excuse me, into the groundwater, also meeting the criteria of 10 milligram per liters, demonstrating that you have sustainable management practices that are appropriate for the recharge of this aquifer within the wastewater that doesn't provide additional, or that doesn't provide above level of nitrate above 10 milligram per liters. Moving on to the second topic, which is the effect of fire on hydrology and geochemistry of soils. We have access to a site in South Carolina, which is called the Francis Marion National Forest. And we have a watershed 80 and watershed 77. Watershed 80 is a control, which is no burn. And the watershed 77 is a site that is being undergoing some prescribed burns over the past 15 years or so. And then we have access to another site, WSAA, which was a more recent burns. And we can see here the different type of the undergrounds, of the understore of these forests. Here, the control, you can see some trees and bushes. Into the prescribed burn site, you see that the understore has been cleared with the prescribed burn. And this is a more recent burn site that shows, of course, the ashes. The dominant tree species on this site are the longleaf pine, the lobberleaf pine, and the turkey oak. So in this site, we collected some bulk samples and also some soil core for hydrologic and some geochemistry analysis. So the watershed 80 and the watershed 77, which is one is the control site, non-burn, and the watershed 77, which is a prescribed burn site, are exactly the same USDA textural classification of soil. They are both sandy loam soil, and the watershed AA, which was a recent burn, is a slightly different. It's a loamy sand. So in our lab, we have access, and on the department, we have access to vertically oriented UCT 3D 4D X-ray tomographic systems, and that will allow us to see the soil structure and also visualize the infiltration process. So here we have the columns here that will be inserted into the equipment to then visualize the phenomena. So this is our undisturbed soil column that we collect into the field site, and then it goes into the UCT machine for imaging. And then we'll be able to see, this is a 3D computed tomography image of the soil structure of the non-burn site, of the non-burn forest soil. And in white, you have the macropore network and also some less dense materials like the roots. And moving on to the prescribed burn site, we also have undisturbed soil columns. And we can see the macropore networks in white, and also the less dense materials, which are roots into the soil. And then moving on to the infiltration experiments, in this case, we're going to be adding some sodium iodine to the column at the top, and we'll be monitoring the transport of the sodium iodine to visualize the infiltration process into the soil core. And this is the example of the non-burn forest soil. That's our control. So here you see a well infiltrations phenomena throughout the entire columns. We have some professional flow effect on the side due to the fact that the columns wanted to be dry. So into the columns, you have a little bit of the bypass phenomena on the side, but that doesn't impact the fact that the whole column was well infiltrated. And now as we move to the prescribed burn site systems, we have again the soil columns, and we can see the infiltration phenomena. And in this case, we have a different behavior of the infiltration process. We still have some, professional flow on the side due to the experiment conditions because the column was let to dry. But you can see that the infiltration is way different from the previous experiments, where in this case, you don't have full penetration of your water, most likely due to the development of saltwater repellency. And as we compare this time series of the infiltration experiments, on the left, which is the control side, versus the right, which is the prescribed burn site, you can see the difference of the infiltration process that takes place. And in terms of the batch subsequent experiments, so we're going to be testing two different types of compounds, polar and non-polar compounds, and see how the prescribed fire impact the absorption properties of these soils. So the first compound was the 1,3,5-trichlorobenzene, which was a TCB, or non-polar compounds. And the second compound was the 1,3,5-3-nitrobenzene, TNB, polar compounds. So we have different concentration amount of soils into the bottles, and we kept constant the TCB and TNB concentrations across. And we use gas chromatography equipment to detect the TCB compounds, and we use HPLC to detect the TNB compounds. So here are the results. So on this graph, you have the amount of the TCB into the liquid phase and the amount of TCB into the solid phase. And if we look at the KD value, which is the shortcut coefficients of the top soils, we can see an increase from the control from 350 liters per kilograms to 450 liters per kilograms when you have a prescribed burn site. We also, of course, have different behavior for the top and the bottoms of your soil, and also different values for your both soils. But the key parameter here is looking at the top soil and its KD values that definitely increase as you have prescribed burn that takes place. And the same goes with your TNB polar compounds. We have for your top soil, your KD value increased from 174 liters per kilograms to about 286 liters per kilograms under the prescribed burn conditions. And here we have KD values and their percent difference with respect to the control versus the prescribed burn site, but also top and bottom soil. You can see that you have not only the prescribed burns that impact the KD values, but also the profiles of the soil depth also play a role into the differences of these KD values. And I would like to conclude by looking at some of these technical messages. Our work, research provides some fundamental understandings of the flow, fate, and transfer of contaminant across media. We looked at fractal flow, but also professional flow, which allows cross-rapid transfer of contaminants. We also demonstrate some interface interaction between the particles, fluid, and contaminants, and also the importance of the feedback and influence of circuit chemistry on the flow and transfer of contaminants. We also developed some method and tools for fluid flow and contaminant transport in porous media, especially looking at monitoring and visualizations, detection, measurement, and characterization of flow and contaminants, and also this application, of course, to environmental analysis. And then in terms of the research application, these have direct applications to development of accurately the sync terms used to describe contaminant transport and retention across media at the Darcy scales. It also allowed to achieve more reliable simulation of contaminant transport in the subsurface, provide insight on how soil heterogeneity and interface influence the development of biochemical contaminations, biochemical conditions, that control the fair transfer of contaminants, and also provide insight on the influence of change in soil properties, train flow, and biochemical process on the mobility of contaminant, and also that, of course, contribute to the assessment of risk of contaminant to both ecosystems and the public health. And finally, I would like to acknowledge my collaborators, my students, and also my collaborators, and would like to wish to convey our appreciation to Clemson University for supporting this work. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Christophe, for a very interesting talk. And thanks to both our speakers, Christophe Darnault and Adrian Collins. I'll go ahead and invite Adrian to turn on his video as well. We have a series of questions. I would like to encourage folks. I'll go ahead and read off these questions, but I'd like to encourage folks to go ahead and please do ask questions in the Q&A box or in the chat box if it's easier. I think I can drive the technology. I'll go ahead and start off with one question for Christophe, which is the imagery was, and this is my part of adding on, the imagery is quite compelling with respect to the prescribed burn and the unburned system with respect to what's happening in the subsurface. I don't know that I've ever seen anything like it. I think it's very, very telling. And the question is, did you do any effort to actually quantify, did you put any effort into quantifying changes in porosity? Because of course you're talking about shifts in macroporosity. Were you actually able to quantify those? I guess the related question is how do we then interpret those shifts? What do you propose with respect to stakeholders then interpreting what those data might mean for them?
So in terms of the, thank you, Monica. So in terms of the first questions, we have not yet interpreted the general porosity. I know there are some software who can do that. You can look at how much spore there is compared to different treatment, and that's something that would be definitely beneficial to quantify the amount of porosity that has changed, because possibly you have change of chemistry, but change of physical structures, and possibly these changes of hydrology and biochemistry for contaminant transport or substance can also be related to the fact that maybe the fire cracks some aggregate and they offer more surface area and so forth, but that's something that will be done. I know that we talked earlier with you and we mentioned Dr. Caronfield. With this, with help of his lab, we have data now to look at the change of the aggregate and their surface. So that could be an insight information for the aggregate itself. But I know that software can be used to look at these computer tomography image to also quantify other overall structures. And then the third part of the questions was, sorry.
I was just going to say, yes, I agree. I think that there would be some really good imaging, given that you have these great 3D images. I bet there would be some options with image analysis. But go ahead, you were going to speak to the next part of the question.
And then in terms of the policy makers or people who have to manage these forests, I will say that what is going to be key is to see how long these effects are lasting. I know that we did some tests at the surface, and we have seen some soil water repellency. That was obvious, the drug didn't penetrate. We also did some repacking of the soil, and it was hard for the water to infiltrate. So definitely the repellency has developed. But in terms of the policy makers and people who have to manage these sites, I will say that to see the lasting effect of how long these phenomena developed over the years, and maybe how long it takes to go back to normals after the prescribed fire has been terminated. But of course, more studies in agreement with, of course, the policy is needed.
Thank you very much. Adrian, there's a couple of questions for you. One of them is, are the on-farm interventions recommended or mandated for farms of all sizes or animal production units?
So there's a mix, as I indicated in my talk. So there are three main mechanisms driving current uptake rates of best management interventions. There's regulation. So some interventions are mandatory and in fact, a new set of on-farm interventions became mandatory for all farmers nationally in England from the 2nd of April 2018. And that's one of my biggest policy impacts. I drove the work that selected that mandatory list of measures. The second mechanism is incentivization. So that would be an agri-environment scheme, or it might be a paid for ecosystem services scheme led by a water utility, where if farmers are in the right place, then they can be funded to implement additional measures. And then the third mechanism, we have a national advisory program called Catchment Sensitive Farming. And that's where we have officers working on the ground one-to-one with farmers in priority areas. Those officers are really driving the win-wins. So they do have a little bit of capital funding, but only at 50% rate. So farmers have to co-fund interventions. It's more about targeting the win-wins, the easy pieces of good practice that farmers should be implementing. So we have a mix. Some measures are mandatory, many are not.
And related to that, then there was another question with respect to, could you comment, and I know you've done this previously, but could you please perhaps comment a little bit about how landowners have responded to these interventions and what the key barriers were with respect to adoption?
Yep, okay. There's a huge diversity in our farming systems for such a small place in the UK. We have, everything from farmers who own just a few hectares to very large commercial units that are many thousands of hectares. And with that diversity comes many challenges and barriers associated with the uptake of interventions. I guess, one that always comes to the fore concerns having good data on costs of interventions, both any upfront capital costs and how they can be amortized within the farm business over a few years, and then the operational costs. For instance, if it's a tillage associated best management intervention, they'd want to know, what are the operating costs in terms of diesel usage and labor in terms of a tractor driver. So what we have done for several years now is a lot of work trying to come up with accurate estimates of those costs, because it's a question that the farmers always ask: what will this intervention cost me? The second question is there any policy mechanism that will at least partially or wholly pay for those costs to my business? Beyond costs, the next main barrier is whether farmers feel they have the technical expertise to implement a best management intervention at the necessary level. And that's where there's been this renewed focus on the advisory network to offer advice on the siting of interventions, and particularly the maintenance of interventions through time.
And I think a good related follow-up question, and we have questions for Adrian and Christophe, so we'll keep going and we have time to do that. So Adrian, what prospects are there or considerations for land use change from intensive farming to treed landscapes to help reduce sediment loads to UK streams?
Yep, so this is the current major policy push in the UK. Since we departed the European Union, there has been a big push towards revising all of our agricultural policy, and people will no longer be paid on a per unit area basis. They will be paid for the delivery of public goods and services. And so we have in draft a new set of sustainable farming incentive regulations, which will be introduced. And a new policy scheme called ELM, E-L-M, Environmental Land Management. And the focus here is basically on natural capital approaches and delivering public goods and services. And there will be mechanisms within there for structural land cover change, because every run that we've simulated with Aspire or indeed alternative frameworks and tools, is telling us no matter what you do with the agri-environment measures and whatever combinations you use, you will not manage the pollution gap at the appropriate level. And so, yes, tree planting is going to be expanding massively in the UK.
Thank you. I've got some follow-up questions, but I'll ask them for you separately. Christophe, I'm going to move on to some of the questions here. And so getting a little bit into the science, then you talked about soil organic matter and its importance with respect to absorption capacity, because of course it's reactive and it has multiple reactive functional groups. Can you speak to what you have learned with respect to the diversity of strategies available to characterize soil organic matter, and where you stand with respect to the various approaches to describing its role specifically with respect to absorptive capacity and potential implications to fate and transport of waterborne contaminants in the subsurface?
Okay. Well, I mean, we've done some work with organic matter and other type of compounds. And we have seen that they have first an impact on the flow phenomena. I mean, this is not related to this talk, but we have the plant exudate, we have microbial exudate, organic matter, humic substances. They impact the flow patterns. They change the surface tensions. They change the interactions of water with the surface processes. And with that, of course, change the possibility of interactions with the contaminants. So in terms of the contaminants, we work with different type of contaminants like the pathogens, radionuclide, nanoparticles, and this kind of systems. And this has shown, of course, that these organic matter have a tremendous impact on the absorption processes, and the fact that you have these prescribed fire that change the properties of soils and also the chemical nature or other element of the particles and soil compounds have an impact on the absorption processes. In terms of the characterizations of the organic matter, that's, it's very complex, and much more work is needed on that area. But definitely, organic matter is an important element of the flow and climate transport in the soil.
Great. Thank you very much. A related question to that, so it's not a follow-up, but it's close to a follow-up, is have you looked specifically at characterization of black carbon in these systems?
Into the prescribed fire, no.
Okay.
We have not done that.
Okay.
But
great.
but I know that other groups have done that.
Okay. Thanks. And one for Adrian, and along the lines of getting into the detailed characterization, and I'll give you one guess as to where this one came from, Adrian. You commented on sediment stress from a yield perspective. Did your work include an assessment of sediment quality changes over time? And if so, would you care to comment? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, we recognize that that's a potentially important part of the equation here, sediment associated contaminants, and of course through time, that pressure, that loading has changed. I think one of the things we've struggled to get our heads around looking at available literature is, again, the noise in the dose response relations that exist for particular contaminants. There, we have focused still on sediment associated organic matter and its impacts on sediment oxygen demand, because that is, to be frank, has been easier. So yes, we do recognize that sediment associated contamination beyond that is an important issue, and certainly some more work needs to be done.
Okay, thank you. And there's a question, another question from the audience, Adrian. If all of the gaps are not able to be totally managed through the ASPIRE program, where does the priority what's the priority, hope, or focus of closing the gap with respect to sediment loading?
Yeah, so this is being intensely debated at the minute, not just from the stance of sediment as a stressor, but also the nutrient stress that we suffer greatly in the UK. And I think ultimately there will be some compromise between protecting critical landscapes and areas within landscapes and the need for us to produce food and the likely consequences of that. One of the really big challenges that we're focusing at the minute are the extreme weather patterns. Our years are so different from year to year. We've been experiencing some very extreme rainfall patterns over the last couple of years. 2019-20 was the 5th wettest winter ever recorded in the UK. February 20 was the wettest February ever recorded. And those sorts of weather patterns result in huge challenges to any mitigation program. And so, yeah, there are lots of issues, but I think ultimately a compromise will need to be reached because we do need some food security as an island.
Yep. Thank you. Christophe, and I appreciate the questions. If people have them, please, we'll take a couple more minutes. I recognize that we're at the top of the hour, but I have at least 2 more questions that, if it's all right with the speakers, I'd like to go ahead and ask. One is for both of you and one is for Christophe. So I'll start with the one for Christophe. So Christophe, it can be challenging to characterize the fate and transport of contaminants in the subsurface because of complicated issues of biogeochemical reactions. And so you've spoken to hydrology and you've spoken to aspects of water quality, especially as driven by organic carbon. How do you think that your findings will relate to natural systems that include, in some cases, significant aspects of biological processing of carbon? So biological activity to shift carbon character in these systems.
That's a very good question. Well, I guess our knowledge is limited on these systems. It shows that the organic matter, carbon change the behavior of the carbon transport. So the fact that now you have in the mix the microorganisms who are going to be impacting and changing the carbon content will probably create some significant changes in what is expected into some other, let's say if you do some test without this organic matter, without the biology, without the organisms, then your result may be quite different from what you would expect if now you put the organisms into play. That would be my answer.
And we have to start somewhere, right? We have to then build. So I agree. That's a tough one, and that's always, I think, a challenge. And so, to be respectful of everybody's time and schedules, I will note that there are several students online. The forWater network alone has trained over 100 students in its 4 years of existence so far. And so I wanted to ask both of you, as individuals who are well-established researchers and internationally recognized researchers, and researchers who work at the interface of multiple disciplines, perhaps to close our talk, given your experience at working at the interface of multiple disciplines, academically, scientifically, but also then at the interface of academia, research, and practice, what is the best advice that you could give to early career researchers, such as graduate students who are looking to embark to change the world in your area of interest? And so maybe Adi, we'll start with you and then we'll switch over to ask Christophe his perspective, if you don't mind. Just whatever your best advice is.
Okay, that's an interesting question. Going on, I guess, my own experience, an experience that I've observed here in the UK, whenever there are opportunities for multidisciplinary work, whether it's a strategic program or a localized program, if there are opportunities to join any of those programs, seize them with both hands. The science that I've been doing for 10, 15 years now has really been driven by those linkages with the other disciplines. You know, when I started, I was just a sediment scientist. I consider myself to be far more than that, although I've spoken to sediment science today. I think those multidisciplinary pieces of work are much better training grounds.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that definitely every problem these days, or even before, they are so complex that you need different views, you need different knowledge and expertise from different people. And it's with the team that you can try to find some solutions or other problems to work on. In terms of advice to students, I would say that they should be passionate about what they do and self-driven, right? I was fortunate to be involved into soil and water at the early stage of my career, and then things branch out, I will say. But what is interesting is that the project and the team is multidisciplinary, so you have different angles, you have different aspects, you do some field work, some lab work, some modeling, some analytical work, I mean, computer work, you know, that's the world we live in. So students should be well receptive that they won't be doing one task. You know, you may start somewhere, but then you have to branch out, and that will be that's the nature of the work, where, you know, in today's work you have to be multidisciplinary, and every work is multifaceted, and students should be ready to balance that, and that will be rewarding at the end, I will say, because, you know, it's not only after 1 month or 1 year that you see your impact, or that you see what you acquire for as expertise. It's, you know, after several years you see how things can connect and apply to different fields. So,
well, thank you so much for both of your answers. I can see from your slides that you both work on very, very transdisciplinary teams, where there are multiple voices, and clearly all those voices need to be heard. Some of the biggest questions lie at the intersection of disciplines, and I think we've seen that abundantly. You know, when we're talking about issues of water security and food security, there are probably no solutions, just trade-offs. And so we have to find the solutions that will work best for the majority of people in society. And so thank you so much. Given the talks that we've had, they will be recorded, they'll be available, and contact information will be posted for the speakers. Again, Dr. Adrian Collins and Dr. Christophe Darnault, thank you so much for your time and for 2 very stimulating and interesting talks. I wish everybody a good day. That wraps up our seminar. So I will wish you well, and thank you again. Have a great day, everybody.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.